Lyra walked down the empty corridor of the detention facility with her mind racing and her heart's beating faster than normal as she tried to make sense of the confusion she felt after speaking with the human prisoner. The Zelvani had two hearts that beat in an alternating rhythm to pump blood through their bodies more efficiently. And right now both of hers were working overtime as adrenaline flooded her system. She had been taught since childhood that other species were inferior to the Zelvani and that the Empire had a divine right to expand across the galaxy and bring order to the chaos of lesser civilizations. Her parents had been proud when she joined the military academy, and her father, who served as a commander in the fleet, had given her his blessing and told her she was doing her duty to preserve their way of life. But something about the human had shaken her carefully constructed worldview, and she could not stop thinking about the way he looked at her with those warm brown eyes that held intelligence and kindness rather than the brutality she had been told to expect. Lyra reached her quarters and sealed the door behind her before removing her uniform jacket and sitting down on her sleeping platform, which was a raised surface covered with thermal gel that adjusted to body temperature. She pulled out her personal data pad and began searching through the official records for information about Earth and humanity, but everything she found was filtered through imperial propaganda that painted humans as barely civilized savages who had stumbled into space travel by accident. Frustrated by the lack of real information, Lyra decided to access restricted files that required her security clearance as a guard, and what she found there made her blood run cold. The reports described multiple incidents where human ships had been captured or destroyed by Zelvani forces, and in every case the humans had been either killed immediately or sent to research facilities where they were studied like laboratory animals. There were images attached to some of the reports, and Lyra forced herself to look at them, even though they made her feel sick to her stomach. She saw humans in cages, and humans strapped to examination tables, and humans who stared at the camera with dead eyes that had given up all hope. The official justification was that these measures were necessary to understand potential threats to the Empire, but Lyra knew in her heart that what she was looking at was nothing less than systematic cruelty. She thought about Jake sitting in his cell and wondered what fate awaited him once the bureaucrats decided he had no intelligence. Value, would he be executed, or would he be sent to one of those facilities where scientists would dissect him piece by piece to satisfy their curiosity about human biology? The thought made her feel ill, and she set down the datapad and pressed her hands against her face, trying to calm herself. Lyra had never questioned her government before because questioning led to doubt, and doubt led to disloyalty, and disloyalty was punished severely in Zelvani society. But now she could not stop the questions from flooding her mind, and each question led to another, until she felt like she was drowning in uncertainty. Over the next several days, Lyra found herself drawn to Jake's cell during her shifts, and she would stop outside the force field and engage him in conversation about topics ranging from the mundane to the philosophical. Jake told her about Earth seasons and how the leaves changed color in autumn, painting the forests in shades of red and gold and orange. He described the ocean and the way waves crashed against rocky shores, creating spray that caught the sunlight and formed rainbows in the mist. He talked about human music and art and literature and the way different cultures had developed unique expressions of beauty and meaning throughout history. Lyra listened to all of it with growing fascination because nothing he described matched the official narrative about humans being crude and unsophisticated. She began to share things about her own world too, telling him about the crystal forests where she had grown up in the way the trees would sing when wind passed through their branches, creating harmonies that could be heard for miles. She described the twin moons that orbited her planet and how they would eclipse each other once every cycle, creating a period of total darkness that lasted for 3 days. Jake asked her questions about Zelvani culture and philosophy, and Lyra found herself explaining concepts she had never really examined before. She told him about the caste system that determined every citizen's place in society from birth and how she had been born into the military caste, which meant her path had been decided before she even took her first breath. Jake seemed troubled by that, and he asked her if she had ever wanted to be something other than a soldier. Lyra had to think about that question because wanting something different from what you were assigned was not encouraged in her society, and most Zelvani never even considered the possibility. She admitted that when she was young, She had dreamed of becoming a musician and composing symphonies that would be performed in the great halls of the capital city. But those dreams had been crushed by her parents, who told her that artistic pursuits were for the lower castes and that she had more important duties to fulfill. Jake looked sad when she told him that, and he said it seemed like a waste for someone to never pursue their true passion. His words struck something deep inside Lyra, because no one had ever suggested that her desires mattered, or that the system she lived under might be fundamentally wrong. The other guards began to notice that Lyra was spending more time near the human's cell than necessary, and one of them, named Kale, approached her. After a shift change, Kale was older than Lyra and had served in the guard force for many cycles, and he had a reputation for being strict about regulations. He asked her directly why she was so interested in the human prisoner, and his tone suggested that he already suspected the answer. Lyra tried to deflect by saying she was simply gathering intelligence about human psychology that might be useful for future encounters. Kale did not look convinced, but he let the matter drop with a warning that getting too familiar with prisoners was against protocol and could lead to disciplinary action. After he walked away, Lyra felt a chill run down her spine, because she knew that Kale would be watching her more closely now. She also knew that if he reported her to the commander, she could face serious consequences, including demotion or worse. That evening, Lyra stood outside Jake's cell, debating whether she should stop visiting him altogether to protect herself. Jake seemed to sense her internal struggle, and he told her that he understood if she needed to keep her distance. He said he was grateful for the conversations they had shared, and that she had given him hope during a dark time. His words made Lyra's decision for her, because she realized that she could not abandon him now, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for. She deactivated the force field and stepped into his cell for the first time, crossing a line that she knew she could never uncross. Jake looked surprised, but he remained seated, giving her space and not making any sudden movements that might spook her. Lyra sat down across from him, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that they could speak in low voices without being overheard. They talked for over an hour about everything and nothing, and by the time Lyra left, she knew that something fundamental had changed inside her. She no longer saw Jake as a prisoner or an enemy, but as a person who deserved dignity and compassion, and more than that, she had begun to see the Empire itself as something other than the benevolent force she had been raised to believe in. Jake Carter opened his eyes slowly as the cold metallic floor beneath him sent chills through his entire body, and he could barely remember how many days had passed since the Zelvani warship had intercepted his transport vessel near the outer rim of their territorial space. His small cargo ship had been carrying medical supplies to a human colony when the engine core malfunctioned, leaving him stranded in space like a sitting duck, waiting for whatever came next. And what came next was a massive alien cruiser that pulled his ship into its docking bay with a tractor beam. He had no way of resisting. The Zelvani soldiers who boarded his ship wore armor that gleamed like polished obsidian, and their faces were hidden behind helmets that made them look more like machines than living beings. And they had dragged him through corridors filled with purple light and strange symbols that hurt his eyes when he tried to read them. Now he sat in this cell that measured roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, with walls made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the only source of illumination came from the shimmering force field that covered the entrance, humming with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. Jake had tried talking to the guards who passed by his cell during what he assumed were shift changes, but most of them ignored him completely, as if he were nothing more than an animal in a cage not worth their attention or concern. Few who did acknowledge his existence looked at him with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to outright disgust, and one guard had even spat on the floor near his cell before walking away without saying a word. He had no idea what the Zelvani planned to do with him, or if anyone from Earth even knew he was missing, and the uncertainty was almost worse than the confinement itself, because at least if he knew his fate, he could prepare himself mentally for whatever came next. The food they gave him twice a day was bland and tasteless, like eating paste mixed with cardboard, but it kept him alive, so he forced himself to swallow it, even though his stomach protested every time. Jake spent most of his time doing exercises to keep his body from weakening too much in the confined space, and he would do push-ups and squats and stretches until his muscles burned and sweat dripped from his face onto the cold floor. When he was not exercising, he would think about home and his family and wonder if he would ever see Earth again with its blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched to the horizon. He thought about his younger sister Amy, who was probably worried sick about him by now, and his parents who lived in a small town near the coast where his father worked as a fisherman and his mother taught at the local school. The memories were bittersweet because they reminded him of everything he had lost, but they also gave him something to hold on to when the darkness of his situation threatened to overwhelm him completely. On what Jake estimated was the 21st day of his imprisonment, something different happened during the evening shift change. He heard footsteps approaching his cell, but these footsteps were lighter and more measured than the heavy boots of the male guards he had grown accustomed to hearing. Jake looked up from where he sat against the wall and saw a female Zelvani standing outside his force field, staring at him with large golden eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. She was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered between silver and pale blue, as if she were made of liquid metal that had been poured into a humanoid shape. And her features were delicate and angular, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that gave her an aristocratic appearance. Her hair was long and white and pulled back into a complex braid that hung down her back almost to her waist, and she wore the standard guard uniform. But somehow, it looked different on her, more elegant and refined. What struck Jake most was the expression on her face, because unlike the other guards who looked at him with contempt or indifference, this female seemed genuinely curious about him, as if he were a puzzle she wanted to solve. She stood there for several minutes just watching him, and Jake found himself unable to look away from those strange, beautiful eyes that seemed to see right through him. Finally, she spoke in a heavily accented English that surprised him, because most of the guards either did not speak his language or pretended not to understand when he tried to communicate. She asked him what his name was and where he came from, and her voice was soft and melodic like wind chimes tinkling in a gentle breeze. Jake told her his name and explained that he was from Earth and that he had been transporting medical supplies when his ship broke down and he had drifted into Zelvani space by accident. She listened carefully to every word he said, and her head tilted slightly to one side as if she were processing information in a way that required physical adjustment. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment before asking him if Earth was as primitive as her instructors had claimed during her training at the military academy. Jake felt a flash of anger at the word primitive, but he kept his voice calm and steady as he explained that Earth had space travel and advanced medicine and art and music and literature that spanned thousands of years. She seemed surprised by his response, and she stepped closer to the force field until she was only a few feet away from where he sat. Jake could see details now that he had missed from a distance, like the way her skin had faint patterns that looked like constellations mapped across her arms and neck, and the way her pupils were vertical slits that contracted and expanded as she focused on different parts of his face. She introduced herself as Lyra and told him that she had been assigned to this detention level 3 cycles ago, which Jake assumed meant 3 months or something close to it in human time. Lyra explained that she had never met a human before and that everything she knew about his species came from official Empire briefings that described humans as violent and technologically backward creatures who posed no real threat to Zelvani superiority. Jake could not help but laugh at that description, even though his situation was far from funny, and Lyra looked confused by his reaction. He explained that humans had their flaws just like any species, but they were not the monsters her government made them out to be, and that maybe, if the Zelvani actually tried to communicate with other species, instead of capturing them, they would learn that the universe was more complex than their propaganda suggested. Lyra looked troubled by his words, and she glanced down the corridor as if checking to make sure no one else was listening to their conversation. She told him that what he said could be considered treason against the Empire, but her voice lacked conviction, as if she were repeating words she had been taught to say, rather than expressing her true feelings. Jake asked her if she really believed he was dangerous, and she looked at him for a long moment before slowly shaking her head. She said that he seemed different from what she expected, and that difference made her uncomfortable, because it challenged everything she had been taught to believe about the natural order of the galaxy. Before Jake could respond, Lyra heard voices approaching from the far end of the corridor, and she quickly stepped back from his cell and composed her features into a neutral mask. 2 male guards appeared around the corner, and they nodded at Lyra as they passed by on their patrol route. She nodded back and waited until they were out of sight before looking at Jake one more time with an expression he could not quite read. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in his cell with more questions than answers and a strange feeling of hope that he had not felt since his capture. That night, Jake lay on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the female guard named Lyra, and wondering if she would come back to talk to him again, or if their brief conversation had been a one-time occurrence brought on by simple curiosity. He found himself hoping it was not the latter, because for the first time since his imprisonment, he had felt like he was being treated as a person rather than a specimen. The journey to the neutral trading station took 3 days of constant travel through space that seemed empty and endless. And during that time, Jake and Lyra had nothing to do but talk and wait and hope they would not be discovered. The small maintenance pod was not designed for long-term habitation and had minimal life support systems that recycled the same stale air until everything smelled like metal and sweat. There were emergency rations stored in a compartment beneath the seats, but they tasted like sawdust mixed with chemicals and did nothing to satisfy real hunger. Jake divided his rations with Lyra, even though she insisted she could go longer without food than humans could, and they took turns sleeping while the other one monitored the pod sensors for any sign of pursuit. During the long hours when neither of them could sleep, they talked about what would happen when they reached the trading station. Jake would need to contact Earth authorities and arrange transport back home, but that process could take days or even weeks depending on where the nearest human ship was located. Lyra had no plan beyond getting Jake to safety, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in with crushing weight. She had betrayed her people and her oath, and there was no going back to the life she had known before. Her family would be questioned and possibly punished for her actions, and her name would be recorded in the archives as a traitor. The thought of what her father would say if he could see her now made Lyra feel sick, but she tried to push those thoughts away and focus on the present. Jake seemed to sense her distress, and he reached over to take her hand in his, offering comfort without words. They sat like that in the dim light of the pod's cabin with their hands intertwined, and Lyra marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. Weeks ago, she had been a loyal soldier following orders without question, and now she was a fugitive traveling through space with an alien she had helped escape from prison. The irony was not lost on her, but she found that she did not regret her choices, even knowing the price she would pay. On the 3rd day, the trading station finally appeared on their sensors as a massive structure that looked like multiple habitats had been welded together without any real plan or design. The station was known as Crossroads, and it served as a meeting point for dozens of different species who came to trade goods and information away from the watchful eyes of their respective governments. It was a place where laws were flexible and questions were rarely asked, as long as you had currency or something valuable to trade. Lyra guided the pod toward one of the many docking ports and transmitted the universal merchant code that would grant them temporary access. A bored-sounding voice responded in broken Galactic Common asking for docking fees, and Lyra transferred the credits she had managed to steal before. Leaving the detention facility, the voice confirmed their payment and assigned them a berth in the lower ring where smaller vessels were kept. As they docked, Jake looked out at the bustling station with wide eyes, taking in the incredible diversity of species moving through the corridors. There were tall insectoid beings with multiple limbs and small furry creatures that scurried along the walls, and massive beings that had to duck to fit through standard doorways. Lyra had visited Crossroads once before during a training exercise, but seeing it now through Jake's eyes made her appreciate how truly remarkable it was. They exited the pod and immediately attracted attention because a Zelvani and a human traveling together was unusual enough to warrant stares. Lyra kept her head down and led Jake through the crowded marketplace toward a communication hub where he could send a message to Earth. The hub was run by a species called the Traders, who specialized in facilitating contact between different civilizations, and they prided themselves on their discretion. Jake approached the counter and explained that he needed to send an urgent message to human space. The trader behind the counter was a thin being with translucent skin and many eyes, and it studied Jake with interest before quoting a price. Jake had no money, but Lyra stepped forward and paid using the last of her stolen credits. The trader led them to a private booth where Jake could record his message without being overheard. Lyra waited outside, giving him privacy for what would likely be an emotional communication with his people. Jake emerged 20 minutes later, looking exhausted but relieved, and he told Lyra that he had contacted the human embassy and they promised to send a ship within the week. Now all they had to do was wait and try to stay hidden until help arrived. They found a small inn on the lower levels that catered to travelers who did not want to be noticed and rented a room using fake names. Room was tiny with barely enough space for one bed and a small washroom, but it felt like luxury after 3 days in the cramped pod. Lyra collapsed onto the bed and closed her eyes, fighting back the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Jake sat beside her and asked if she was okay, and Lyra laughed bitterly at the question. She told him she did not know if she would ever be okay again because she had thrown away everything for him, and now she was adrift with no purpose and no home. Jake was quiet for a moment before speaking in a soft voice. He told her that she did not have to be alone and that when the human ship arrived, she could come with him to Earth. Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him, trying to determine if he was serious. He explained that Earth had policies for granting asylum to refugees from oppressive governments, and that she would qualify, given what she had sacrificed. He said she could start a new life there, and maybe even pursue that dream of becoming a musician that she had told him about. The offer was so unexpected and generous that Lyra did not know how to respond. She had assumed that once Jake was safe, their paths would diverge, and she would be left to wander the galaxy as an exile. But here he was offering her a chance at something more than mere survival. Lyra felt tears forming again, and this time she did not try to stop them. She told Jake that she wanted to go with him, but she was afraid of being a burden. Jake shook his head and said she could never be a burden after everything she had done for him. He said that she had shown him more kindness and courage than he had any right to expect, and that he would be honored to help her build a new life. They spent the next 6 days hiding in that small room, venturing out only to buy food and check for messages. The waiting was agonizing because every moment they stayed on the station increased the risk of being discovered by Zelvani agents. Lyra jumped at every unexpected sound, and Jake tried to keep her calm by teaching her more about Earth and human culture. He told her about music festivals and art galleries and universities where she could study composition if she wanted. He painted a picture of a world that seemed almost too good to be true. But Lyra found herself wanting to believe in it anyway. On the 7th day, a message arrived at the communication hub from the human embassy ship. They were arriving within hours, and Jake should proceed to docking bay 17 for extraction. Lyra and Jake gathered their few belongings and made their way through the station, trying to blend in with the crowds. They were almost to the docking bay when Lyra spotted something that made her blood freeze. Standing near the entrance was Commander Fex along with a squad of Zelvani soldiers. Somehow they had tracked the fugitives to Crossroads, and now they were waiting to capture them. Lyra grabbed Jake and pulled him into a side corridor before they could be spotted. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out an alternate route to the docking bay, but every path would eventually lead them past the soldiers. Jake looked at her, and she could see the determination in his eyes. He told her they had come too far to give up now, and asked if she trusted him. Lyra nodded because at this point trust was all they had left. Jake explained his plan, which was risky and relied on creating a distraction large enough to draw the soldiers away from the docking bay. Lyra wanted to argue, but she knew they had no other options. She kissed him then, surprising both of them, and told him to be careful. Then she set off to implement their desperate final gambit, while Jake made his way toward the human ship. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fates but also the future they had dared to imagine together. The following weeks brought a pattern to Jake's imprisonment that was both comforting and dangerous, as Lyra visited his cell almost every day during her shift, and each visit lasted longer than the one before. They developed a rhythm of conversation that felt natural and easy, as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks, and Jake found himself looking forward to seeing her face appear outside his cell. Lyra would sometimes bring him food from the officers' mess hall, which was far better than the standard prisoner rations he had been surviving on, and once she even smuggled in a small device that played music from her home world. The melodies were strange to Jake's ears, with notes that seemed to bend and shift in ways that human music never did. But there was beauty in them nonetheless, and he listened with his eyes closed, letting the alien sounds wash over him. In return, Jake taught Lyra some English songs that his mother used to sing when he was a child, and Lyra would try to hum along even though her voice could not quite hit the same notes that human vocal cords could produce. They laughed together at her attempts, and those moments of shared humor felt precious in the sterile environment of the prison. Jake began to teach Lyra about Earth's history, starting with ancient civilizations and working forward through time. And she was fascinated by the stories of human struggle and achievement. She was particularly interested in the concept of democracy and the idea that citizens could choose their own leaders rather than having their rulers determined by birth or military conquest. Lyra admitted that such a system seemed chaotic and inefficient compared to the Zelvani Empire's strict hierarchy, but she could not deny that it also seemed more fair and just. Jake explained that democracy was not perfect, and that humans still struggled with inequality and corruption and abuse of power. But at least there were mechanisms in place to hold leaders accountable and to change course when things went wrong. These conversations often led to discussions about freedom and what it meant to different species and cultures. Jake told Lyra that he believed every sentient being had the right to make choices about their own life as long as those choices did not harm others. Lyra found this idea both appealing and terrifying, because her entire society was built on the principle that the collective was more important than the individual, and that personal desires should be subordinated to the needs of the empire. She began to wonder what her life might have been like if she had been born on Earth instead of her homeworld, and whether she would have chosen to be a soldier, or if she would have pursued her dream of becoming a musician. One night after a particularly long conversation, Lyra sat in her quarters staring at the ceiling and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions she felt. She had to admit to herself that her feelings for Jake had grown beyond simple curiosity or even friendship, and that realization frightened her more than anything else. In Zelvani society, relationships between different species were not just frowned upon, they were illegal, and anyone caught engaging in such behavior could be exiled or even executed depending on the circumstances. But Lyra could not deny what she felt, and she could not stop herself from wanting to spend more time with Jake, even though she knew it was dangerous. She thought about his smile and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed and the gentleness in his voice when he talked about his family. She thought about how patient he was with her questions and how he never made her feel stupid for not understanding human concepts right away. Most of all, she thought about the way he looked at her without the judgment or contempt she saw in the eyes of her fellow Zelvani, who considered her interest in the prisoner to be a weakness. The next day, Lyra was called into Commander Vex's office, and her heart sank as she walked down the corridor, knowing that this meeting could only mean trouble. Commander Vex was a large male with scarred skin and cold eyes that never seemed to blink, and he had a reputation for being ruthless with anyone who broke regulations. He was sitting behind his desk when Lyra entered, and he did not invite her to sit down, which was a bad sign. Vex told her that he had received multiple reports about her inappropriate behavior with the human prisoner and that such conduct was unacceptable for a guard of the Zelvani Empire. Lyra tried to defend herself by saying she was gathering intelligence, but Vex cut her off with a sharp gesture. He told her that he was not interested in her excuses and that she was being reassigned to a different section of the facility. Effective immediately, Lyra felt panic rising in her chest as she realized she would no longer be able to see Jake, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Vex's expression stopped her. He leaned forward and told her that she should be grateful he was only reassigning her, because the penalty for fraternizing with prisoners could be much worse. He said that if she continued to show interest in the human, they would have no choice but to take more severe action, including possible court-martial. Lyra left the commander's office feeling numb and walked back to her quarters in a daze. She knew she should accept the reassignment and move on with her life, but the thought of never seeing Jake again made her feel like something inside her was dying. That evening, Lyra made a decision that would change everything. She waited until the night shift began and most of the facility was quiet before making her way to Jake's cell one last time. When Jake saw her standing outside his force field, he smiled. but the smile faded when he saw the expression on her face. Lyra deactivated the barrier and stepped inside his cell, and before she could lose her nerve, she told him everything. She told him about the commander's warning and her reassignment and the fact that this would probably be the last time they would see each other. Jake listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her what she wanted to do, because he said the choice had to be hers, and he would not try to influence her decision. Lyra looked at him and felt tears forming in her eyes, which was something Zelvani rarely did, because crying was considered a sign of weakness. She said she did not want to lose him, but she did not know how to fight against an entire empire. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and when she did not, he took her hand in his. His skin was warm compared to her cool touch, and she felt that strange flutter in her chest again, only this time it was stronger. He told her that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to stand up for what they believed was right, even when the whole world was telling them they were wrong. He said he understood that what he was asking was not fair, because she would be giving up everything she had ever known, but he also said that he believed she was strong enough to make her own choices, and that whatever she decided he would respect it. Lyra sat there holding his hand and feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought about her family and her career and everything she would lose if she helped Jake escape it. She also thought about the restricted files she had seen and the cruelty of the Empire, and the person she would become if she walked away. Now she looked into Jake's eyes and saw not just a prisoner or an alien, but someone who had shown her that there was more to life than blind obedience. She made her decision in that moment, and once it was made, she felt a sense of clarity she had never experienced before. Lyra told Jake that she was going to help him escape, and that they would figure out the details together. She knew it was probably a suicide mission, and that they would likely be caught and punished severely. But for the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path instead of following the one that had been laid out for her, and that choice felt like freedom. Planning an escape from a maximum security Zelvani detention facility was not something that could be done hastily, and Lyra knew they would only get one chance to make it work. She spent the next 3 days memorizing shift patterns and security protocols while pretending to accept her reassignment to the upper levels where political prisoners were held. The commander had not yet processed the paperwork for her transfer, which gave her a small window of opportunity to act before she lost access to Jake's section entirely. Lyra used her position to access maintenance schedules and discovered that the facility's primary power grid underwent routine diagnostics every 7 days during the night cycle, when most of the staff was at minimum capacity. During these diagnostics, the backup generators would take over, but there was always a brief flicker lasting about 5 seconds when systems switched from primary to secondary power. That flicker would be their window, and Lyra knew they had to be ready to move the instant it happened. She explained the plan to Jake during one of her final authorized visits, and he listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. Jake asked her if she was absolutely sure about this, because once they started, there would be no turning back and she would be branded a traitor by her own people. Lyra told him she had already crossed that line the moment she decided to see him as a person rather than a prisoner, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The hardest part of the plan was getting Jake proper clothing and equipment, because his current prison uniform would make him stand out immediately if they encountered anyone. Lyra solved this problem by stealing a maintenance worker's outfit from the laundry facility along with a respirator mask that would hide Jake's distinctly human features. She also procured 2 plasma pistols from the armory by forging a requisition order and hid them in a storage locker near the service tunnels on the night of the escape. Lyra felt her hearts pounding so hard she thought they might burst from her chest as she made her way to Jake's cell at exactly midnight station time. The corridors were dimly lit and mostly empty, with only occasional patrols that she had learned to predict and avoid. She reached Jake's cell and found him waiting by the force field, already dressed in the maintenance uniform she had smuggled to him earlier. Lyra checked her chronometer and saw they had 7 minutes until the power diagnostic began. She used the time to review the escape route one more time, making sure Jake understood every turn and checkpoint they would need to pass. The service tunnels would take them to the lower docking bay where smaller transport pods were kept for station maintenance and supply runs. Lyra had already programmed one of the pods with coordinates that would take them to a neutral trading station near the border between Zelvani and human space. From there, Jake could contact Earth authorities and request extraction, while Lyra would have to disappear and start a new life somewhere the Empire could not find her. Jake asked her what she would do and where she would go, and Lyra admitted she had not thought that far ahead. All she knew was that she could not stay here and continue to be part of a system that treated sentient beings like animals. The chronometer hit the designated time, and Lyra held her breath as she waited for the power flicker right on schedule. The lights dimmed and the force field flickered off for exactly 5 seconds. Lyra deactivated the emergency backup just before it could engage, and Jake stepped out of his cell for the first time in weeks. They moved quickly, down the corridor, staying close to the walls and avoiding the main routes where security cameras were most concentrated. Lyra led them through a maze of passages that she had memorized during her years working at the facility, and Jake followed, close behind, trusting her completely. They were halfway to the service tunnel entrance when they heard voices approaching from around a corner. Lyra grabbed Jake and pulled him into a small alcove that housed environmental control panels, and they pressed themselves flat against the wall, barely breathing. 2 guards walked past, talking about some sports game and completely oblivious to the fugitives hiding just feet away. After they passed, Lyra waited a full minute before moving again, and her hands were shaking as she led Jake forward. They reached the service tunnel entrance, and Lyra used her security code to open the sealed door, praying that the commander had not yet revoked her access. The door slid open with a hiss, and they slipped inside just as another patrol rounded the corner behind them. The service tunnels were hot and cramped with pipes and conduits running along every surface, and the air smelled like ozone and machine oil. Lyra navigated by memory and instinct, moving through the darkness with Jake following close enough that she could hear his breathing. They had been traveling for about 15 minutes when alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the facility. Someone had discovered Jake's empty cell, and now the entire station would be going into lockdown. Lyra cursed in her native language and grabbed Jake's hand, pulling him into a run. They raced through the tunnels as emergency lights began flashing and blast doors started closing to seal off sections of the facility. Lyra reached a junction point and made a split-second decision to take a less direct route that would keep them away from the main security checkpoints. The detour added precious minutes to their escape, but it also meant they avoided running straight into the guards who were now flooding the corridor searching for them. They emerged from the tunnels into a cargo staging area that was blessedly empty, and Lyra led Jake to the docking bay entrance. She used her override code to open the bay doors, but this time an alert sounded, indicating that someone in security was tracking access attempts. Lyra knew they had maybe 2 minutes before armed guards arrived at their location. They sprinted across the docking bay toward the small transport pods that were lined up against the far wall. Lyra found the one she had programmed earlier and activated its systems while Jake climbed into the passenger seat. The pod's engines began warming up, but the process seemed to take forever. As Lyra watched the entrance, expecting guards to burst through at any moment, finally the pod system showed green across the board, and Lyra initiated the launch sequence. The bay doors above them began to open, revealing the star-filled void of space beyond. Just as the pod started to lift off, the docking bay entrance exploded inward, and a squad of guards poured through with weapons raised. They opened fire, and plasma bolts streaked through the air around the pod, scorching its hull. But, missing the critical systems, Lyra pushed the throttle to maximum, and the pod shot through the opening bay doors into space. Behind them, she could see other ships beginning to launch in pursuit, and she knew their escape was far from over. Jake was gripping his seat so hard his knuckles were white, but he managed to ask if they were going to make it. Lyra did not answer right away because she was too busy plotting an evasion course through the asteroid field that surrounded the station. Pursuing ships were faster and better armed than their little maintenance pod, but Lyra had one advantage, which was intimate knowledge of this sector from years of studying navigational charts. She dove into the asteroid field and began weaving between massive rocks that could crush their pod like an insect if she miscalculated even slightly. The pursuing ships followed, but they were less willing to take risks and gradually began to fall behind. One of the ships tried to take a shortcut and clipped an asteroid, sending it spinning out of control into the void. The others became more cautious after that, and Lyra used their hesitation to put more distance between them. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Lyra managed to lose their pursuers completely by hiding the pod behind a large asteroid and shutting down all non-essential systems to minimize their energy signature. They waited in tense silence for another 30 minutes before Lyra felt confident, enough to restart the engines and continue toward their destination. Jake finally released his death grip on the seat and let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at Lyra and smiled despite everything, and told her that was the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of his entire life. Lyra could not help but smile back, even though she knew their troubles were far from over. They had escaped the facility, but now they were fugitives with the entire Zelvani military looking for them. Still in that moment, with Jake beside her and infinite space spreading out before them, Lyra felt something she had never truly felt before. She felt free,